Hello everyone, I'm Mike Fauché, aka PC Doc on the Home Server Show forums. I like to start today by kind of going through a build. Some of you are new at building computers and have never seen it done or never have an opportunity to build one yourself, so I thought I would do a short video since I'm in the process of building one right now and kind of walk everyone through the basic process. Let's first talk about the components that we have laid out here. And in part one here, we're going to just basically go and kind of cover the motherboard. And we're going to cover mounting the CPU, mounting the RAM, and mounting the CPU heatsink. So for starters, we have our CPU, which in this case is a Core i3-540. We have our DDR, 4 gigs of DDR G-Skill. This happens to be 1600. We have a back panel here for the which is comes with the motherboard. I'm not showing all the cables and stuff that come with it at this point. And then we have the actual motherboard itself, which in this case is a H55S2H. It's a gigabyte H55 chipset. It's a micro ATX. So let's walk through the basic connectors on the motherboard, and we'll review some of them as we're hooking them up inside the system. For starters, we have along the back we have the front panel connectors, which will make more sense when we put it into the case. We have our USB and FireWire ports. We have our floppy drive, which isn't used often anymore. We have 6 SATA ports on this particular board, and we have our PCI Express and PCI, and we have some our DDR slots, which are located here, these blue slots. We have an IDE connector, and then our main 24-pin power connector, which is where our power supply will go, which again we'll see as when we I'll put this baby into the case. Around the back side here we have our 4-pin power connector, which is again from the power supply, which we'll get into a little bit later. We have our in this case 4-pin headers for either 3-pin or 4-pin fans, mainly in the CPU and system fans. So, and in the center here, the part that we're most interested in, which is the CPU socket. So for starters, let's begin by opening up the socket and inserting our CPU. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually open up the socket, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so everyone can see. Okay, and the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to actually lift off the protective cover, exposing all the pins on the inside. Now you got to be really careful with this. You don't want to touch these pins at all with anything. They're extremely fragile. Besides voiding your warranty, they'll make your system basically inoperable. So they're very, very soft, and they're intended to be soft so that because there are so many of them, that when you drop your CPU in, you can easily not make contact with some of the pins, and the amount of pressure it would take to actually push that CPU in, if these were actually stiffer pins, would be a tremendous amount of force. So they're basically very fragile. You stay away from them at all costs, and be very, very careful when you're inserting your CPU and you're removing your CPU, if in the event that you are removing it. So let's get into dropping the actual CPU. So I'm removing the CPU here from the box, and going to actually insert this CPU here. I'm removing it from the protective case here. Now, one thing I want to mention is, you notice this gray mat here. I'm actually working on a static safe mat, just to make sure that nothing gets damaged. Now, the first thing I want to point out is, if you look at the CPU, and this may be kind of hard to see on the on the video, but there are basically here in the corner there are two little notches, one over here on this side and one over here on this side. And if you look carefully at the socket, you'll see that there are matching notches. This is basically how you orientate the CPU. So first thing I'm going to do is actually drop the CPU in, and we're basically going to just set it in there. We're not going to push it, and we're not going to do anything like that. So after I've lined it up, I'm just going to basically just set it in there very lightly, basically just a drop. And once it's loaded in there and I'm verified that it was flush, I'm going to actually drop the socket holder, or the top of the socket on top of the CPU. And again, I'm going to close the lever very carefully, and that will push the pressure down onto the CPU. So now that CPU is locked in place and it's ready to go to the next step. So in this case, the thing we can, there are multiple sequences in which you can do this with, but what I like to do next is actually get the heatsink on there. So I'm going to actually take that out of the box. And again, looking at the heatsink, you're going to want to determine where to position it. And there are 4 holes here on the motherboard that will allow you to put the pins in that are actually located here on the back of the CPU. So you have some pins here that are actually push pins, which we'll get into a little bit in just a second. And then of course you have your, in the center here, which you're not going to want to touch with your hands, is the thermal compound that's actually pre-loaded onto the CPU heatsink. Now this is symmetrical, so you can position it any way you'd like. What you're going to want to do though is position it to where it makes sense for cable routing. So if you're looking at this, this device here, we're going to actually pull the wire out because they have it loaded in here. So we're going to pull this, which they've jammed into the fan here, and you notice it's got little clips around there, so I can basically position this where my CPU socket is located here, or the power socket is located here. So now I can basically install this to where the wires will reach the most comfortably. So the best place for me at this point would be to pop it either here, this way, or this way, and then I can actually remove the cable from the clips. So I'm a symmetrical type of person, so I like the label facing the right direction, so I'm going to go ahead and pop it in this way. So as you drop this in, you'll see the pins just kind of push right in, but that's not the end of the story. So now that we've actually pushed it in there, our job now is to actually insert it. Now what I usually do is lift the board up a little bit and grab it with both hands and push the first pin in on one side, and then physically push. And you hear that little click when you push those push pins in. So that basically makes sure they're inserted. I try to avoid pushing down on it this way onto the board, because that's a little bit, you depending on what you're working on, you can actually bend the board and do some damage. So I typically, when the board's out of the system, I actually push them down by supporting the board with my hands underneath. And again, I'm working on an ESD mat here. Putting my hand underneath like this, I actually go now to the third side, lock that in place, flip the board around, and get the last one. And there's the last one. I don't know if you guys heard that click or not, but I basically now have all 4 pins locked in. So again, I'm just going to make sure that they're down and secure by pushing down on them, and I've now mounted my CPU. So I'm getting close to being ready to insert it. I got a couple more things I got to do. So first thing I'm going to do is take these cables off so that I have enough room to actually circle it around and insert it. Let me make sure that everyone can see this here. But what I'm going to do next is actually insert this into the header pin like so, and then I'm going to dress the wire so it doesn't touch the fan, and I'm just going to let it sit here for now, and I'll tie this up a little later. But I now have inserted my heatsink on my CPU. And again, you could basically route this any way you'd like. I showed you basically how to install it. We could have rotated this 90 degrees and had a little bit less cable. But what I usually do is tuck this in underneath, and it'll make more sense when we show the finished product. Okay, and then that leaves us into the last step, which is actually inserting the RAM. So I'm going to zoom back out here for just a second. So I've got my G-Skill RAM, which again I'm going to take out of the ESD protected package, and I now have my 2 sticks of RAM. Okay, if we look closely, there's a notch on the RAM, and that notch is actually off center. Okay, if you match this up to the board, you can see, and it's kind of hard to tell in the video, but that notch will match with the notch that's in the slot. So if you have it turned the wrong way, it's not going to fit. The next thing you want to do is make sure these are pushed out, and then you basically insert it into the slot. And if anybody can see this, what I usually do at that point is to grab each side, and again with my thumb underneath, and push both sides in very carefully, and that snaps that RAM right in. Okay, again we're going to go back in and do the same thing with the other side. Going to make sure it's lined up. And again, I'm going to lift it up and push down on the heatsink and snap that guy right in there. Make sure you hear that click from that board, otherwise you're not going to get the system to boot. And there we go. We now have loaded the RAM, CPU heatsink, and we're now ready to mount the board into the case. Stopping